So actually, I'm going to go back for a second and start with this slide before I forget. My program director asked me to show this. I partly work at ICCS, the Institute of Computing for Climate Science at the University of Cambridge, and we're organizing this sort of online hackathon aligned with this thing called Hacktoberfest I think it's in October. And it's a chance where you could kind of get together with people who do programming in science, collaborate with people on open source software projects in climate science. So if this is of interest, take a look. We've got some sort of information. You can get that here. So I'll just leave that for a second. It's an event that we're running later this year. Okay, so on with my talk, and thanks to all of these people who are listed on the slide, sort of people I work with. This is like a position paper, as it were, like a kind of, that's why I wrote it in this way. This kind of position that I'm putting forward is that general purpose programming languages impede scientific model development and communication. This is my position, and I'm going to talk about some possible ways forward and also show a work in progress kind of solution that might, towards this kind of solving this problem in this space. So thanks to all of my colleagues here for sort of conversations and work on this idea. So I want to start with this idea that code is really about communication. Okay, we could primarily say it's like communicating with the computer, but it's also how we communicate amongst ourselves as humans. And so in the past, when people did science, they used mathematics as the kind of central language of describing models, or at least, let's say, kind of from the kind of scientific revolution sort of onwards. So you'd write down some equations that would kind of capture this physical behavior, and maths is really, really good at that. But now, our models are these very large piles of code, and actually there's so much sort of detail in there that gets embedded in the code that really the sort of model that we want to communicate now is okay, there's some mathematical equations, but it's also the whole code as well. And we've seen discussions already about the scale. You know, we're talking for things like Earth system models can be up into the sort of close to 1 million or a couple of million lines of code, and even smaller models, they can still be rather large and difficult beasts to understand. We've also talked about FAIR earlier, so Cyrus had a nice discussion of that. There's been loads of great progress in recent decades about I guess kind of socio-technical progress about the fact that we need to have our code be open so that people can actually use it, and based on these FAIR principles. So it's not just enough to have the papers that describe what's going on, but you also really need to share the code, because that's where the actual key parts of your scholarship are in the actual model that you want to put forward of whatever processes you're looking at. But then we have some problems that come with this. You know, sharing the code is great, but it doesn't sort of solve the problem of how we communicate about the science that we're doing. And one of the things that kind of works against us is the inherent complexity and the accidental complexity. Now, the inherent complexity we can't get rid of. You know, that's there in the things that we're modeling. And what we want from our programming tools and the things we're doing is to kind of illuminate what's going on in the inherent complexity, and then avoid all of this accidental complexity. So when we write down the code, we have to make all of these choices about how to run it efficiently and how to kind of plug into all of our systems, and that starts to complicate the code. And you know, a long time ago, I was writing sort of data parallel fluid simulations, and it's like you basically just have to rewrite the code every time that you want it to target a different architecture. And so there's all of this accidental complexity getting in your way. So we want to avoid that. A bunch of kind of experiences that are kind of informing some of the things I'm going to talk about today came from a collaboration we had with actually some people here at NCAR, up the hill at the Mesa Lab, and various folks around the world, where we were looking at moving a data-driven subgrid model, one of these parameterizations, moving it from one particular atmospheric model called SAM into the community atmospheric model, which is part of CESM. And the kind of idea was like we had to take this paper and the code that came with it. It was a sort of neural network parameterization. It was part of SAM, but it was kind of written in a way that it was like too heavily embedded into that piece of code. And where the starting point was like, oh yeah, we should just be able to sort of yoink it out and put it into this other model. But as we kind of all know, it's not so straightforward to do that. We had to sort of really re-architect this. And when I say we, it's really Jack was doing a lot of this work as one of, he's a principal research software engineer at ICCS. And so he re-architected it into these kind of really well-defined layers with well-defined interfaces so that you could sort of take out this middle bit and then move that over to CAM, and then write this kind of CAM interface to the data-driven model here. But doing that was also very difficult and required a lot of interaction with the people who'd written the original paper and with the sort of scientists and the folk at CESM who were, the folk at NCAR who work on CESM. They were super helpful. But there was a lot of this kind of, what does this variable mean? What are its units? What's its resolution? Does it mean, is this a change? Is this a tendency? Is this an offset? Things like that. So there's a lot of kind of understanding what the code actually does. And it sort of didn't really describe itself in a way that helped us do that work. So that kind of experience, Jack and I have then spent lots of time talking about what are the right kind of software engineering principles that would have helped avoid this situation. I think this is kind of what I like to call the semantic gap. It's emblematic of this kind of gap that we get between our papers and our code. The papers get written, they have the nice equations in them, some abstract model. Then we have to do some discretization, some numerical analysis, and then write a load of code over here. But then there's a sort of gap that opens up between the two, and they become sort of decoupled. And our programs often sort of throw away a lot of the original abstract ideas. The abstract ideas we put in the paper don't describe the code, and we get this gap that then kind of impedes our scientific work. So this is the mind the gap is like a classic thing in the UK when you're getting on the train, and they always say, please mind the gap. I think my colleague Rowley has this really pithy thing. He actually said this on Friday in a meeting, and I was like, yes, this is really it. He said, treat the code as your knowledge base. When you have knowledge, serialize it into the code. And I think this is something that we can sort of aspire to if the code is then this kind of central place in which we discuss the scientific work and kind of can also unite around across different disciplines. Like, it's great to have lots of different disciplines here today, and like one of the places we can kind of communicate is via the code. But how do we do this, right? And so I think the contention in this position talk and paper is that our programming languages don't really help us to do this very much at the moment. They're like too general purpose. And general purpose is good. I can take Python, I can do loads of stuff with it, which is brilliant. But then when I want to do science with it, it's sort of that generality can work against me. So how do we close the gap at the moment? This is the bridge in my college that goes from the old side to the new side. It crosses the chasm. It lets us bridge between worlds, so a bridge between two different places. How do we bridge between this semantic gap at the moment, between our kind of scientific ideas and our code? Well, one thing we've kind of talked a bit about already is naming. And names are good, right? But then, you write some code and you get things like this. This is I think this comes from the convection parameterization thing I was mentioning earlier. And you sort of look at it and go, what does this mean? This is like absolute temperature, and this is maybe temperature, and what is this thing? And they're some real arrays in Fortran. This is like a classic thing that I'm always telling my students, write variable names that actually describe what's going on. And then, of course, I go and write code where they're called things like A, B, X, and Y, right? So from the programming language point of view, from the language semantics, names have no semantics, they have no meaning. Like in the programming language world, we have this idea of alpha equality. Like if I say I have a function that takes in an input X and returns it, it's the same as the function that takes in Y and returns it. But actually, names are really helpful to humans and maybe also to things like LLMs. And we had this, I rewrote my slide earlier based on the Deepak's talk before, where he made this point about in X array, the really nice thing about X-array is you can actually name the dimensions in your metadata rather than saying like X-axis is 0, which you can't remember. So lots of things, lots of developments that exist have kind of pushed us towards actually describing what's going on in the domain in the code. So X-array is good for that in Python. But often we can kind of get into this situation with like very long kind of naming about things, and one of the problems is that names are they're not compositional. So we mentioned oh yeah, so this was, I also stole this from the talk as well, right? Like this is a kind of it's a name that's been just put together by like string concatenation, but it sort of then has no structure, and it's hard to connect us back to where it came from. And also, it is hard to name things as well because you have to then have some sort of agreed set of names, and often the names are like different in different places. So you might get like sea surface height from an oceanography point of view, and then like water level from hydrology. These might actually be the same thing, so you need to sort of deal with different communities. And CF conventions got mentioned before. This is like a really great, I think this is like a success in the sort of space of you sit down and as a community you kind of come up with a naming scheme for things, but then those names do get very long and very complicated, and they're not very compositional, they don't have any structure. So you get sort of these like very long names for things like atmosphere, absorption, optical thickness due to black carbon ambient aerosol, and then you've got one that's about due to dust ambient aerosol particles. And the naming is good because it helps us kind of then explain what variables mean, but they're not decomposable, and you can't build them up from smaller components. Okay, comments, right? Comments are really important, and like documentation in general. But the problem is it's second class, it doesn't have any semantics, it kind of gets thrown away by your compiler, thrown away by the language, doesn't really exist from the sort of actual meaning of the program, largely. It doesn't have any structure, it ages like bread, it goes stale, or like milk, it goes sour, and so it's sort of decoupled from your actual code. And I remember a conversation I had probably about 20 years ago with some scientists, and we were looking at their code that had units of measure in it. And I said, oh, this is really nice. You got the units of measure for each variable. And then the postdoc was like, oh, no, that one's wrong. Oh, no, that's not that anymore. It's like it had just kind of gone out of date. There are nice, like fancy kind of tools that help us extract documentation from comments, things like Sphinx and Ford and Doxygen. These are all super helpful. They like surface our comments to us in a structured way. Doc strings are an interesting thing in Python because they do actually have some computational meaning. They're not like purely a comment. So we can do things with these kind of richer commenting structures, and just like a really nice example from some of our collaborators. This is a eco-optimality model of plant primary production. They have really nice documentation that has like maths in it, and it generates these really nice docs. Like this sort of stuff is great, and the comments are there with the code, which I think is largely a good thing. But then, this can easily get out of date with actually what the model is doing, because there's no connection between them. Just a mention of something that we've worked on recently. So Fluid is this programming language that Rolly Pereira is one of the, he's an early career advanced fellow at our institute, and it's a really cool language for building visualizations that are automatically explorable. He's talked about it at previous PROPLs. And we've just added this feature called literal execution. So you have this kind of comment that you can put in the code, and then when you execute the program, that gets sort of interpolated into extra explanation that comes with the execution of the program, with like spliced in values. So okay, it's a little bit hard to digest this. Sorry, this is just a grab from the paper, but this is a kind of output you get from Fluid, and you can click on a bit of the output here, and it brings up the input from which is computed, and this comment here, this kind of special comment syntax, generates this extra information here that comes along with the execution, sort of explain how the computation has been done. So we use the term literate execution to be, it's like we're executing, but we're like explaining how that was produced automatically. So I just had a recent paper about that. I don't want to talk too much about notebooks. We had an interesting discussion about that before. Like the idea of literate programming is you like write lots of comments, and you could see notebooks as an evolution of that. I think there are a lot of problems. Like notebooks are great, and they have done some really cool things for the community. But I have observed, and as many of others, and Cyrus talked about this, they do become very monolithic and not very modular. They don't guide people towards like well-modularized bits of reusable software. And lots of problems with like execution order and state persistence and so on. So one thing I'm very keen on, my collaborators know, is trying to have like single source of truth techniques where you have like one way of describing something from which you generate multiple artifacts so that you're not having like the paper says this and the code says this and the documentation says this and so on and so forth. A kind of way of closing this gap is to try and have some kind of representations, like single source of truth representations, from which you generate lots of stuff, so you only have to change one place and these things don't become out of sync. And there are lots of examples of this around the place. Project that we were doing internally was to do with looking at sort of optimal the kind of Pareto optimal frontier of land use in the UK between sort of forests and agriculture and all these kind of things. And Robert Rouse, who I should mention on here, who's worked on this, he has this really nice kind of dashboard and all of this cool genetic algorithm stuff for doing this modeling. And one of the things I was looking at when we were doing this work is saying, well, you have all of these equations that are like constraints on your model, and they kind of get replicated in lots of different places. They're like described in the paper, they're in the code in order to constrain the genetic algorithm, but they're also in the code to constrain the dashboard that we produce as the output. What if we just described them once and then like generated all of these from that description? So we have like a deep embedded DSL for this. I'm not going to do a live demo because it will take too long, but you write some Python that describes these constraints between variables. You know, you can't just like have the UK and make it all be forests and all be agriculture and all be houses as well. Like there has to be some constraints. We can't do it all at once. And this generates then constraints on the UI between these little sliders. So if you move the grassland up, then the organic regenerative farmland has to go down. It also constrains the genetic algorithms, and it also generates the LaTeX for the paper. So you just have one single format that's like a syntax tree essentially, and you generate all of the things from it. So that's trying to like close this gap, but in a very like we solve this problem in one place kind of situation. So you do get kind of approaches that are more about having structured comments, so things like doc tests. They're a kind of format where then these comments get read and they get turned into tests that like the automatic test suite will use. So that's really nice. It's like putting a little bit more into what the comments actually do, giving them some meaning by some external tools. You could also have comments that have some specifications in them that are then read by other tools. So this is something we did in the CamFort project, where we looked at building lightweight verification tools for Fortran. And we had things like units of measure typing. Well, we have this in the tool. So this is Fortran code, but with comments that then the CamFort tool reads to do dimensional analysis checking on your code. So you can sort of run CamFort units check on this code, and it checks whether this is really supported. And you can do things like synthesize additional unit information into it. And the idea is that those comments are then, they have some meaning that's read by another tool. It doesn't interfere too much with the process of the rest of the scientists because they're still just comments. You don't have to run CamFort on them. But it's like trying to bring in some structure to those comments to, again, bring in some of that real domain information. Like these are not just arrays of reals or reals, they actually relate some physics. So they should have some units, and we should be able to do a dimensional consistency. So there are lots of like partial solutions to bridge the gap. We could like work really hard on documentation, and we should do that. That's good. We should do some like clear systems design that kind of reflects the science and try and think about, okay, can we build things that are modular, that are sort of like kind of well described. This is good. This is sort of basically sort of saying people should put more effort in software engineering. And I think we're going to hear like a talk in the next talk, which will give us a sort of like maybe an approach to thinking about how we make models more modular, and like one way of doing that. But because my background is programming language design, it's sort of, well, could we have programming languages that help us do this better? What could it look like to have a language that's sort of pushing us in this direction to bring that domain information to our program? So, okay, going back to this, we want to sort of avoid this situation where we just kind of have these big real arrays of things. What if we could sort of bring more of that kind of information about what things actually mean into the language? And so I'm going to sort of break cover a little bit today. PROPL seems like a nice place to do it and announce a language that we've been working on. It's a prototype research language at the moment called PROPL', but it's kind of designed to be descriptive and sort of maximally descriptive for doing sort of domain-specific modeling, or also perhaps prescriptive as well, because it has static checking, so it sort of forces you to commit to the interfaces you've designed. So I'm going to give, so it's statically typed. We have this way of indexing types like floats with additional information in a very lightweight way that you can sort of keep adding more and more and more and more information into the types. So the kind of float type, a little bit of type notation here, it's a sort of index type, so it expects to know about some descriptor structure, G, and then it also has this bit of information X which lives inside of G, so G is a type of descriptions, and associated to float we should then have an actual description X that lives in that G, and then that produces a type. And it's Python-like, so we can lower the barrier to entry, and maybe this is sort of what we're thinking of it as like one of these kind of orchestration languages. We're not necessarily saying like yet like we want this to be the orchestration language, but it's a playground for some ideas. Okay, so I can do a very quick demo of the very kind of early release. And this is not mirrored, so this is going to be okay, let me just switch to mirroring, sorry. Bear with me.
You're brave, Dominic.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, there we go. Okay, so here's a really simple PROPL program. It looks like Python, right? X, Y, T, and it runs. At the moment, this is just floating point, but with not any extra information. But then we can start attaching information to this, saying, for example, that X is a float, and it has units, meters. Okay, here's another float that's also unit meters. Here's a float that's unit seconds. Okay, let's reload this. So this is a bit like the kind of Python REPL, but it's got some typing going on there as well. And so it's inferred that the type it's a float, and its description is a unit of measure, and that unit is meters per second squared. Okay, it's calculated it in that order, seconds to the -1 times meters. And that's fine. And if I had something else like here, where, I don't know, I put miles instead, then we'd get a type error saying, like, hey, it says it twice, just so you get the message. I expected this to be meters and miles, and you can't add them together. But okay, it's not just about units of measure, because sometimes you need to go beyond that. What about kinds of quantity to say, it's a meters thing, but it's actually a length? And we might need to distinguish multiple kinds of lengths, multiple kinds of meters things from each other. Let's do it like that, for example. So then we get some like additional information very smoothly, and if I came along and said, oh, this is a meters thing, but it's actually in an orthogonal dimension, maybe you can't add that, and you don't want to be able to add those things together, right? Because it's like a length and a height, they're in orthogonal bases, and so by adding this additional kind of quantity description, then this is prevented. So early days, but the idea is to be able to like very easily like add in more and more of these layers in a domain-specific way for what you're doing beyond just dimensional analysis. Maybe you want to be able to distinguish between the moist air constant and the dry air constant. Right? They're both having the same effect in the equation of state, but they describe different states of the atmosphere, and so you might not want to mix them. So that could be another kind of layer that you put in, or maybe you're like chemical species. So like if you're doing biogeochemical modeling, you want that to be an additional bit of information. So it's all about being able to do this in like a very lightweight way, without sort of lots of big overhead. So that was the demo. There's a bunch of maths into how this is structured in the type system, which I'm not going to go into, but if you want to know about it, you can come and geek out with me about that. It's based on this idea of an abelian group graded field. And actually we have like a generalization to that as well. But roughly it's like you've got two floats with the same descriptor, that's fine. If you're multiplying them, then you're going to multiply descriptors. If you're dividing, you're going to use the reciprocal. And then there's a sort of casting relationship. So this is a kind of somewhat known idea, and we're using that to build the type system. Okay. So I've been thinking about this for a while. We had this position paper like more than 10 years ago where we were kind of thinking about this, and one of the roadmaps there was to think about sort of, there might be future cool languages we could do, but we should also talk to scientists now where they're at and sort of have an evolutionary approach. I think what we're trying to do with PROPL is look at like what could the future be like, how could we build such a system. Let's like take the idea that we could build better languages for science seriously. What might that be? Okay, so I'm going to stop there. I mentioned that already. I put the slide in case I forgot it. So thank you very much. I think I got about 3 minutes for questions.
Yeah.
Mm.
That was very interesting, the last part where you had to statically type with the formal.
Yep.
And you have the units in there, but oftentimes you don't know the units.
Mm.
You know, you may have, you know the English should be lengths, there should be meters, but you could run the model in centimeters.
Yeah, okay.
As long as they all jive.
Yeah.
Except for maybe some cases, like I'm thinking like using invariants or something, which is parallel relationships and coefficients that have to be exact.
Yep. Yeah, that's a really great question. So it's sort of like, what do you do if you don't know the units, or if you're like agnostic to them, or something like that? Actually, I don't have it here in this one, but what we've been thinking about is being able to just talk about things like dimension length and not specify the unit. So that makes a lot more sense in the context of like a function that takes some input. So if you thought about like f equals ma, you could describe that as like okay, I take these two variables m and a and produce the force, but that could just be described at the dimensional level rather than a units of measure level. So we've been thinking about that in terms of having kind of like a hierarchy between these, what we call descriptors, where from like dimensionality, you could say, well, I can generate the SI version of this. So there's like a conversion from dimensions to units of measure, like the SI translation, but I should be able to describe things very generally that maybe only think about dimensionality. Like that would be possible in this system. And you also don't have to commit to this. Like you can just work with raw floats, or you could even, like in this example, we could go back to this version, but then actually remove the units. The units don't have to be there. We could think of it, and I should make this type check, like that's fine. So you can kind of have like, oh, they're this kind of quantity, but we haven't committed to the units. So I think there are sort of, by having enough flexibility and some polymorphism and some of these kind of hierarchy things, that's where we're heading towards. But it's a great question, and we're definitely thinking about that.
And in this case, I guess it would be okay if it was quantity length times quantity height. That should.
Yeah, that would work, yeah. And then you'd get the height length overlapsed kind of, yeah.
Thanks, Tom. Sorry.
Yeah.
Maybe building off of this, but maybe the opposite direction. So sometimes models are intentionally non-dimensionalized before they get implemented in code. And so I'm wondering, how do you see that sort of, those sorts of programs fitting into this language, or is that like not the right thing to?
No, that's a great question. So what about things where you've like normalized them to be unitless, I think is what you're saying. So even if you normalize things to be unitless, you might still want to know about what does this thing kind of mean and where's it come from. A good example of that, another example of that I think is ratios. Ratios are interesting because they're just unitless, right? And often we work with things like kilograms over kilograms in like atmospheric physics. We want to like look at like densities of things. But you want to distinguish that ratio from angles. Angles are another kind of ratio. So by having these like, it's essentially like layering on these different dimensions, you can still have things where it's like, well, this is unitless, but it comes from this quantity and it like has this meaning. So the idea with quantities is a bit like that. It's kind of like separate, could be related, but it can also be separate. So you could describe different kinds of ratio, even though they're all just unitless, but still be able to separate those out. Yeah. So I think the same would be true for like something that you'd deliberately normalize to be dimensionless.
Yeah, I know. I think the typical workflow might be doing the normalization in pen and paper and then in code.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if there's a different workflow that might.
Yeah, so I can, maybe there's like a program transformation or a higher order function way of thinking about that could be implemented in something like this. Yeah. Great, I think I better stop there and cede the floor to the next talk.